The following series is meant as pure fan fiction, and in no way does it share the views of anyone else or those involved in this story. Due to the length of this following video, there will not be a recap for 2003. But I am assuming, since you've made it this far, to 2004, that you have a good idea of what has happened previously in the story. If you have not, please go back and watch this entire series from the beginning. So let's get right to it. This is If Kurt Cobain Lived, 2004. January 2004. In the beginning of the month, Kurt and Paul McCartney have been back and forth talking to lawyers and real estate agents, trying to figure out a way for Kurt to purchase the property in Scotland that he's been talking about. In the tail end of 2003, Paul found out who owns the property. It belonged to an old man in his 80s who had left the property virtually unattended for the past decade, as his family had ushered him in to a care facility. They could no longer take care of him, as the property was so far out of reach for them, and it was unethical to have an 80-year-old man take care of himself in that old decrepit house in the middle of nowhere. So the house has been more or less untouched since 1995. The only obstacle Kurt faces when attempting to buy the property is finding out who the family who now owns the property is, and contacting them, as well as coming up with the means to make a deal. For all Kurt knows, the property isn't even for sale. In the meantime, Chris Novoselic has been hanging around Kurt's house more often, and attempting to convince Kurt it would be great for the band and their financial future if they went to release something, even a single. Kurt initially doesn't want to, but eventually he sees how important the financial gain will be for him and his daughter, and the property he plans on buying. Kurt decides to get into contact with Dave Grohl to get his thoughts on the project idea. After speaking with Dave, they agree that they should finish what they started and release something on Kurt's label, especially now that Kurt owns the rights to a large majority of Nirvana's catalog. The question that remains is, what should they record and release? It's clear that Kurt isn't in the mindset of releasing a full album or doing anything with it after it releases. But all through 2003, the band had been back together and writing new material. Everyone is in agreement that it would be a terrible waste of good music to not do anything with the songs. So Kurt makes the decision for the band to start recording the songs officially. Dave Grohl does state that he's been in talks with Taylor Hawkins about taking Foo Fighters off of hiatus, but also mentions that if Nirvana wants to record some material, he will set some time aside to do so, as he loved it and had some of the best times in recent memory while jamming with Kurt, Chris, and Pat. Kurt starts planning time for the guys to get together and informs Pat about the plans as well. Dave doesn't outright say it to Kurt, but he knows in his mind that the Foo Fighters is top priority in his life. On January 20th, after doing some digging with a real estate agent as well as his attorney, Paul McCartney gets a hold of the owner of the property. By the end of the month, Kurt has more or less sat around at home, with Francis slowly packing up his home items and leaving his recording gear intact for the forthcoming recording sessions that he has planned out. Although by this point in time, Nirvana has yet to jam together at all this year. February 2004. On February 3rd, Kurt calls Chris Novoselic and sets up some recording time for the following week. Dave and Pat are also in contact that day. They speak about the upcoming Nirvana recording sessions at Kurt's home studio. but they also discussed the possibility of Pat returning to Foo Fighters when their inevitable return becomes a reality. Pat responded to the idea at the time by simply stating, quote unquote, "Let's stick to one thing at a time." Dave agreed, and the plans are made for them to arrive together at Kurt's place next week. February 9th, 2004. The band arrives at Kurt's home studio, just outside of LA. The place that he's been living for the past decade. It's quiet there. It's a rural neighborhood, and it's not the setting you'd see a band like Nirvana record their album in. You walk in the door, and the entire interior of the house is covered in paint, almost like a child was given a paintbrush and told to do whatever they want. Except here you can tell that everything painted on these walls was calculated, and it all has some sort of meaning. This home studio was built the last time Nirvana was actually a band. The last time Nirvana recorded an album. This was the place. This studio was built as a surprise to the band. Kurt was keeping it a secret. If we look back, we remember that Rohypnol from 1996 was originally set to be recorded at Paramount Studios in Los Angeles. The band tried a session at the studio before ultimately deciding against it due to, quote unquote, being too large and too rock starish. Kurt unveiled his studio to the band, and they completed the sessions at his new studio, which he was very proud of at the time. Regardless of the animosity going on in the band in 1996, this studio has a rich history. Christotomy was recorded here. A lot of bands recorded here, and many different producers sat at the helm of the mixer. It's a shame that Kurt wants to pack it all up and fly far away from it. It almost seems like such a waste of such a vast lineage, but when Kurt gets an idea in his mind, he sticks with it. The band gathers into the studio jam room. The layout is different than it was when they recorded Rohypnol, and nobody finds it weird that this is the same place that album was recorded. When Nirvana reunited in 2001, they used Kurt's studio jam space, and it was never spoken of. But now, as they get together to officially record an album, it seems as if the heat is on, but all four members tried to keep their cool and maintain their composure. Kurt knew about the past and thought about it often, so he figured every time the band would do something important in that studio, he tried to rearrange the room just a little bit. Dave Grohl would be quoted years later saying, quote unquote, "It was different that time. When we did the first album, the ashtray was on the right side of the room. This time, it was on the left side of the room. Entirely different setup." There was no set time frame for this recording session. Nobody even thought of how long they would need to record this album. It was more of a come and go type of atmosphere. There is no concept for the album, no title, no artwork. The idea doesn't even really exist. Right now, it's just raw music. And this time around, in 2004, the music is a lot harder than we are used to hearing. This is the heaviest Nirvana has ever sounded. Kurt says they should just record the entire album in one take. Hit record and play through the entire album, like a live performance. The rest of the guys didn't want to do that, and Kurt eventually agrees to work on a handful of songs. But the way the songs will be recorded was virtually the same idea. Much like in Utero, in Rohypnol, with the whole band sitting in a room together and then hitting the record button. Nirvana records 2 songs in the first take, and Kurt will add guitar overlays and vocals later. The rest of the album will be recorded exactly like that, but on separate days. February 9th, 2004 marks the first official day of Nirvana's new, untitled album. More time is scheduled between the band for February 15th and 16th. On February 28th, Kurt receives a call from Paul telling him all the information he needs to know about the house he's been doing research into. He's spoken to the family, the owners of the land. They want to schedule some form of meeting between all parties to figure out what Kurt really wants. Kurt plans to fly to Scotland. This time he is accompanied by one of Paul McCartney's appointed lawyers. In the meantime, Dave has a long conversation with Taylor Hawkins telling him they will eventually get the band back together, but that he needs time to finish recording some drums for Kurt. March 2004. In the beginning of the month, more recording time is set aside for all four members. Kurt wants to get some work done on the album. Some of the guys almost feel like he's rushing to get it over with. He seems disconnected from the music and less interested. Clearly, he has a lot on his mind. It's mainly the house in Scotland that he wants to buy. He just can't get it off his mind. The band records Living the Lie in full on March 2nd, 2004. They recorded the entire song in 2 takes and then moved on to random jamming for the day. Dave pulls Kurt aside and lets him know how important it is for the band to get this album done. No mention of touring or playing any shows has come up at all lately. It's been nothing but getting together and recording the material the band has worked on for the past 2 years on and off. They just want to get it done. In the meantime, Kurt has also been thinking a lot about the Nirvana catalog and what route he should take to maintain any type of longevity in his content. He briefly discusses the idea of re-releasing Nirvana's old music with the guys, but nothing comes to fruition. The idea of a box set also comes up, but again, the guys would rather just focus on the new material, with Chris outright telling Kurt that they have enough material to sell right here, and they should just spend more time working on new music. For the rest of the week, Kurt and Pat jam around on guitar, coming up with ideas. Dave's song, Podunk, is mentioned to Kurt, as Pat wonders why they haven't spent any time with the song since the trio played the song in their very short-lived 2002 reunion, when Pat wasn't around. Kurt blatantly tells Pat, quote-unquote, "We aren't using it." When Pat asks why, Kurt responds with, quote-unquote, "Dave already released it as a B-side to one of his singles like 10 years ago. We can do better." So the idea of using the song on the album is more or less thrown out the window. Pat and Kurt continue working on guitar parts. The two of them together record a song titled Friends of Mine that day. This version is the version that will be released on the album. By mid-March, there is still no concept for the album, and no title has come to Kurt's mind. It's simply just a new Nirvana project at this moment. By the end of March, Kurt successfully sets up a meeting with the family who owns the home in Scotland. They meet at a small law firm in Scotland on March 23rd. Paul's lawyer that he appointed to Kurt is present at the meeting. Kurt wanted to get this meeting over with, and he's been thinking about it for weeks. There hasn't been a day it hasn't crossed his mind. He can only hope it goes well and he's able to get what he wants. The meeting initially starts off great. It's clear the family knows who Kurt is. They just wonder why he wants that old decrepit house as much as he does. It's a dump. The family had left it in the state it's in for so long. For a reason. There's no running water. The insulation is nearly deteriorated. Some of the windows don't even close all the way. For someone of Kurt's stature, with the money he has and the current house he lives in, it's hard to wonder why he'd be interested in this house in the first place. He explains to the family it just struck a chord with him. When he first saw it, It was almost a feeling of love at first sight. Something about the house drew him in and he couldn't escape its grasp. In a weird way, it's almost as if he gets the same feeling from this house that he once got from shooting up heroin. After an hour-long meeting, a price for the property is decided on by the family. It is not disclosed publicly, but it is said to be a lot more than Kurt was expecting. The meeting ends and Kurt says their lawyers will be in touch. After the meeting, the attorney pulls Kurt aside and tells him that the family is clearly taking advantage of him. They know who he is and how much he's worth, and they are asking way too much for that old broken-down house. Kurt shrugs it off and tells the lawyer he really needs to think about it. What only Kurt and the lawyer, as well as the family, know is how much they asked for the property. They want $10 million. Even Kurt knows that's way too much and that he's being ripped off, but he decides not to think about that right now, and he decides he wants to go take one more look at the place, and arranges a ride to the property. Later in that same day, Kurt arrives at the couple's house, the same couple who took him in and gave him a place to stay when he was trying to escape life at the beginning of last year. They are so happy to see him, and will gladly take him in at a moment's notice, with no call or warning that he was arriving. He lets them know about the meeting he had with the family and asks the couple to take a walk with him to the old house, to which they respond with, quote-unquote, "How about we just take the truck?" Kurt agrees and the three make their way to the old house. Kurt spends the rest of the day with the couple, as they try to explain to him he's being ripped off at that price that's being asked, to which Kurt responds with, quote-unquote, "I don't know. Maybe it really is too good to be true." Upon walking into a room with a busted window, Kurt notices a bird's nest with eggs and one newly hatched baby bird. He rushes over to comfort the bird, as none of the other eggs have hatched, and the mother is nowhere near in sight. He's seemingly infatuated by this fresh hatchling, and he takes it in the palm of his hand and starts petting its tiny head. The couple comes in and says they should leave the bird alone before the mother comes back and thinks we're stealing the eggs. They don't know what type of bird it is. It could be dangerous. Kurt gently puts the bird back into the nest and the three leave. On the ride back to the couple's house, Kurt looks back at the old house, almost as if he knew he might never see it again. Kurt stays the night at the couple's house before catching a flight to the US in the morning. He says his goodbyes as if he will never see the couple again either, but they just shrug it off and say, "See you in a few months, friend." The following day, Kurt arrives back home outside of LA, where Frances Bean is home alone. She's now old enough that Kurt doesn't feel like she constantly needs supervision. He sees her as a very smart young girl, and he knows she can take care of herself. She will be 12 this year. April 2004. We have arrived. This series has made it a full 10 years after Kurt Cobain's death in our real timeline. I always knew in the back of my mind that this was the goal. I always wanted to reach the 10-year mark, to show where Kurt's life could be after 10 years. A lot has changed in his life, and you'd really have to go back and watch the entire series to get all of the details, because there is simply just too much to get into. But now that we have reached this point, we can effectively start the next stage in this series, the next 10 years. But before we get into the next 10 years of Kurt's life, we must tie up all the loose ends we are left with in stage 1 of this series. This brings us to April of 2004, where the wheels really start turning, and the decisions made and the events that happen in the following months really set up the course of Kurt's future. April starts off as a busy month. The band immediately gets back into recording. Pat isn't present for the first jam session as he was busy with family at the time, but that doesn't slow the guys down. Kurt can't seem to get the house off his mind, and he can't forget how the family asked for way too much money from him for such a little property. Kurt is also going through withdrawal at this time. He's been trying his hardest to stay off of sleeping pills. Kurt plays out several different scenarios in his head on how he can make it work, even thinking about how he can sell his current house. And even then, he'd have to fix the house in Scotland up entirely, and he'd also have to do a full renovation, which will cost him a lot of money on top of the money they are already charging him. It almost doesn't seem worth it anymore. So instead, at this time, Kurt decides to focus on music entirely. On April 2nd, 2004, the band, minus Pat, records All Wet Yet Nice, a song written sometime in 2002. Pat will come to the studio at a later date and fill in some of his parts that were left empty for him. Kurt liked the idea of Pat doing some of the solos this time around, and leaves the solo for All Wet Yet Nice open for Pat to put his parts down later on. Dave asks about Podunk, and Kurt gives the same explanation that he gave to Pat a few months back. The song was already publicly released as a B-side to a Foo Fighters single, and Kurt doesn't want to use it again. But he did, however, enjoy playing the song live. So they do keep the song on the back burner in case they decide one day they want to play an extra song on the set list. On April 12th, Pat comes to Kurt's studio and finishes up some parts of the songs that were recorded. Most of this album is recorded in one take. The band hit record and just played the songs, and that is the final version that you will hear on the album, minus some of the extra guitar parts added by Pat, as well as a few extra vocal tracks. On April 16th, the band gets together to record the album version of My Summer. Kurt still hasn't come up with the lyrics for the verses, but the chorus is more or less set in stone. Most of the song's riffs and structure were provided by Dave, something Kurt was a lot more open to this time around. But still at this time, Dave has only contributed to a handful of the songs on the album. During the meeting with the band, Chris mentions that he was asked if the band wanted to fly to Seattle to play a show, similar to what they did in 2002, to promote their upcoming release and to more or less let people know that the band is still around. Kurt doesn't immediately answer, and they start working on My Summer. This time, the song is recorded with full vocals over the band in one take. And during the song, Kurt begins doing some type of spoken word type thing over the verse, where he begins talking about going to Seattle. This more or less confirms that Kurt is interested in going to Seattle to play this show. The rest of the song is basically just Kurt rambling about his life the past few years. The band also records a demo run-through of the song So Unsightly before packing up for the day. Chris mentions that he will get in contact with the promoter and let them know the band has given the green light to fly out to play a show in Seattle, and that he will call Kurt with all the information. At this time, Kurt is continuously thinking about the house and even considering paying the money the family was asking, but sets up a meeting to renegotiate. By the end of April, the band has a handful of songs fully recorded for the upcoming album, which at this time still has no name or concept. May 2004. In the beginning of May, Kurt is back and forth talking to Paul again about what they can do to secure Kurt's financial future now that they own the rights to Nirvana's music. A box set is once again brought up, but Kurt never really liked the idea of reselling his old material, especially now considering that the band has an entirely new album in the works. The idea is pushed to the side once again as Kurt continues to talk about the house and the family, and how much they wanted for the house. Paul reiterates to Kurt that he truly believes the family is attempting to rip him off and get more money out of him than the property is worth, solely due to his fame and financial position. They knew who he was and what he has done, and they know he can afford it if he really wants it. Paul believes it's not worth it, but still encourages Kurt to follow his heart and pursue the things he wants most in life. Maybe him and his attorney can bargain the family down to a better price. That's if Kurt still thinks it's worth it. A few weeks into May, Kurt walks into Frances' room while she's working on a school project. He glances at the TV and sees baby birds on the screen. Immediately, he's reminded of the baby birds he saw at the house just a few months back when he was last on the property. He asked, "What's this?" Frances calmly states, quote unquote, "I'm working on a school project for biology about oviparous animals." Kurt responds with a simple, and then asks Frances if she can put the tape in and record it for him, referring to an old VHS tape Kurt used to record stuff from TV to watch later. Frances tells Kurt, "This is a tape. I got it from school." Kurt asks if he can watch it later, to which Frances responds with, "Of course." Later that night, unable to sleep, Frances walks into the living room to go to the kitchen to grab a drink. She sees her father sitting on the couch with all the lights out. The only light on in the room is coming from the TV. Kurt's eyes are bloodshot and barely open, but he's watching a TV screen with birds laying eggs. To which Frances said, "Dad, go to bed. Why are you watching this?" Kurt very slowly looks over and says, "I like birds," and goes back to watching the TV. Frances thinks it's weird, but this is her father, and this is what he's like, and she goes back to bed. The next day, the band arrives to record the album version of Rather Say. Chris and Pat felt like this song will be the hit song on the album, but to Kurt, it's just a throwaway song from Christotomy that he purposely neglected to include on the album. When the band started playing the song, Pat wasn't using many effects pedals and opted to play the song in a much softer tone. Kurt stops everyone from playing and says, "No, I want the songs a lot harder than that. I want all the songs on this album a lot harder than this." And then starts complaining about the sound of the album. He wants everything to sound heavier than usual. And he doesn't want to release what everyone expected him to release. He knows they are getting old. Kurt had just turned 37. He knows everyone expects him to sit in a chair and play acoustic music until he's dead. So he decides that this new album will be the complete opposite. He makes a statement and says he wants this album to be more reminiscent of Bleach than anything else, with scorching guitar riffs and drums that feel like they could come through the wall at any minute. Dave loves the idea and immediately starts playing harder. He even suggests going back through each recording and redoing the drums to sound a lot harder than they were previously. Kurt responds with, quote unquote, "We have all the time in the world." Chris would prefer a softer sound on Rather Say, but knows he won't win when it comes to an argument between him, Dave, and Kurt, so he keeps his mouth closed on the subject. The full instrumental that is on the album is recorded that day. Vocals will be added in later. Chris and Pat leave and Dave stays behind to finish up some old drum tracks. It didn't take him long at all, banging out every single song they recorded previously in one take. Around this same time, Dave continues to have talks with Taylor Hawkins and other members of Foo Fighters for a potential break in their hiatus, although it's clear he's still focused on Nirvana at this time. On May 19th, Kurt receives a call from Chris with information on the Seattle show Nirvana was asked to play to promote their new record and their return. Kurt agrees to do the show, and the date is set for May 25th, 2004, to play in Seattle. Kurt informs the rest of the band, who are all in agreement, to play the show. The week before the show, the band spends most of their time together rehearsing for the show as well as recording a few more tracks for the album in the process. On May 25th, 2004, Nirvana arrives in Seattle. Instead of booking hotels for their stay, Chris opted to stay with family in the area. Kurt and Pat get a cheap motel. Dave enlisted his previous tour manager from his time in Foo Fighters to set up the show. Dave doesn't get a hotel or a place to stay. Instead, he plans on leaving Seattle directly after the show to meet with friends. Upon arriving at the venue, the band is greeted by a number of familiar faces, including members of Mudhoney and Sonic Youth, as well as Patty Schemmel, former drummer of Hole, who played drums on Kurt's Christotomy record. Kurt lets everyone come backstage with the band rather than sitting out in the crowd to watch the show like everyone else. Chris and the promoter of the show enlisted 2 small-time local bands to open for Nirvana, much like the string of shows the band played in 2002. A battle of the bands was held over the span of 4 nights at a local dive bar which consisted of 12 bands from around the Washington area. Bands would be voted to move into the next round, and the final 2 winners would get to open up for Nirvana. What Kurt didn't realize initially is how big this show is for Seattle. So many people from so many places came to see Nirvana on this one night. Seattle looks like a booming tourist town when Nirvana is around. A lot of people who Kurt didn't expect to run into actually showed up, including Mark Lanegan from Screaming Trees and Kurt's short-lived side project, Relevant, as well as Kurt's longtime best friend Dylan Carlson, both of whom still live in Seattle at this point. Kurt is visibly happy to see Mark and Dylan. It's almost as if their friendships have never missed a beat, regardless of what each individual has gone through in their personal lives over the years. Although, being in this setting once again, Kurt's anxiety begins to spike, and the nervousness of performing in front of all these people has finally begun to sink in. So Kurt, Mark, and Dylan head outside for some fresh air. Dylan knew Kurt very well and could tell the anxiety is starting to sink in, so he reaches his hand out and opens up his fist to reveal a small white pill. Kurt looks at it and then looks into Dylan's eyes. At first he didn't want to take it, but he takes the pill and swallows it, as Mark calmly hands him a bottle of water to wash it down. This is the first thing the 3 of them done together in years. They begin talking about Nirvana's new material, and Mark tells Kurt they should really put together a new music video to promote the upcoming album. Kurt responds by saying he's not really interested in releasing a music video, and that he just wants to release the music and be done with it. Both Mark and Dylan disagree and say that they should put something out, even if it's just old clips of the band, almost like a send-off of the old band and ushering in a new era of the band. Kurt explains they already did that in 1995 with the single for You Know You're Right, to which Mark responds with, "Whatever, man, do it again and make it different. It'll mean a lot to you and the fans of your band." Kurt says he will consider it. Kurt's anxiety levels seem to be at a record high, so Dylan gives Kurt yet another pill. And Kurt takes the pill. These guys knew Kurt, and they knew what to do. Kurt's mood begins to change later on in the night as the opening bands are playing. He's a lot more relaxed and not so worried anymore. Before the band has a chance to get their gear on the stage, Kurt starts feeling dizzy. He gets sick and starts hallucinating. He looks over at Dylan and asks, quote-unquote, "What the fuck did you give me?" To which Dylan responds with, "Nothing serious, man, just the usual." Kurt says, "What the fuck is the usual?" Dylan responds with, "It's like half the dosage of a roofie. It'll just calm you down a little bit. It won't put you out." Kurt hasn't taken Rohypnol in years, and it's clear his body is trying to reject it, especially with the recent withdrawal he's been going through, amplifying the effects of the drug. Now it's making him sick right before they are set to go on stage. He lays down in the fetal position backstage behind the guitar rack as Chris Novoselic walks in as Kurt is in this state. This is all too familiar for them. Chris is visibly upset when he sees Kurt in this state, and unfortunately for both Chris and Kurt, Chris immediately assumes the worst and thinks Kurt took some drugs before they were set to go on stage, which in this particular case is the truth. But it was unknown to Kurt at the time the ramifications of taking this harmless pill before playing for a sold-out crowd. Pat Smear eventually enters the room around the same time as Kurt is slowly getting back on his feet. With a visibly shaken Chris Novoselic standing close by, he comes over to comfort Kurt, and Kurt pushes him back, not exactly looking to see who it was. Pat is now visibly shaken and says, "What the fuck happened in here?" Before Kurt says, "Whatever, let's just go do this." Dave Grohl is already out on stage warming the crowd up. He's the biggest star in the entire band, and he has become the life of the party over the past few years of playing big shows and touring with Foo Fighters. This is nothing to Dave. He's used to it. Kurt, however, needs to get himself back into the mindset he previously had when the band was playing shows. He needs to remember who he is and what he's accomplished, and he needs to get over it. Dave introduces the rest of the band and they come out on stage. The lights are directly in Kurt's eyes and he can barely see the crowd. In his mind, he thinks this is perfect. By the end of the night, it's clear the band played a killer set, almost as if they didn't miss a beat since their last performance together in 2002. They are well tuned and they've definitely practiced for this. We won't get into the full detailed set list, but I will say they played a handful of brand new songs from the upcoming album, which Kurt announced halfway through the set. They also played pretty much every hit Nirvana song you can think of. It was a long show, it was dark, it was hot, and it was sweaty, and it felt like the Nirvana we remember from before they hit it big with Nevermind. The show was a major success, and the band is asked to come back to Seattle to play again, to which Chris responds with quote-unquote, "We'll definitely be back when we tour the new album." Kurt was feeling ill at the end of the show and wasn't around to dispute that claim, but he never agreed to a tour of any kind. It's also still unclear what Dave wants to do in the long run. It's obvious he wants to bring Foo Fighters back from hiatus soon, but he also really enjoys his time in Nirvana. Some newer fans of Nirvana who weren't around when the band was at its height of its popularity see Nirvana as Dave's side project, simply because they grew up in a time where Dave Grohl was the lead singer of successful rock band Foo Fighters, while Kurt more or less lingered around doing nothing and staying out of the spotlight. There's still a lot of Foo Fighters fans who don't even know who Kurt is at this point in 2004, other than being the guy who sings and plays guitar for Dave's other band. Nirvana fans, however, are very excited for this long-awaited official return of the band. With a new release on the horizon, this is huge for them. It also becomes a hot topic in the media, especially on Much Music, who reports on Nirvana reuniting like it's some sort of sacred thing. Anytime Nirvana is around, Much Music is on the task now that MTV has more or less become nothing but reality TV at this point in 2004. Much Music still covers popular music, like MTV once did when Nirvana was still big. It's all part of the marketing plan. Dave Grohl would say years later about Much Music covering every step Nirvana took in the 2000s. He went on to say, quote-unquote, "MTV died years ago, and channels like MTV were essential to breaking bands into the mainstream. Much Music more or less stayed that way for a long time, and there's a lot of people in Canada with access to that channel on basic cable. It was huge for the band at the time. Without channels like that, music dies." Dave Grohl and Foo Fighters performed live at Much Music a handful of times in our real timeline. On May 31st, just a few days after Nirvana played their highly successful return show in Seattle, PJ Harvey released her newest album, Her, which was being conceived during the tail end of her relationship with Kurt. and one of the hit singles is seemingly directed at Kurt. He's not aware that she released a new album at this time. June 2004. The final recording sessions for the album are scheduled for this month. There's a few songs that will still need to be recorded, as well as some finishing touches on some of the songs that were already recorded. Kurt has been consciously thinking about the music video idea that was suggested by Mark Lanegan. Kurt decides to bring up the idea to the band to see what they think of the idea. Chris believes they should actually film a brand new video as a full band. But Kurt explains that nobody wants to see a bunch of guys in their mid-30s pretending to be young again, and discusses Mark's original idea of using old footage for the band. Almost like the video itself serves as a send-off to the old Nirvana, to usher in a new era of the band. And then maybe they can film a brand new video after that. Pat immediately suggests Rather Say, as he and the other members of the band believe that that should be the lead single for the album. It's the catchiest song on the album, and it's totally radio-friendly. Kurt agrees and says he will start working on it himself later in the week. He also lets Frances know about the idea. He likes having her input and ideas for his projects. On this same day, the band records Real Eyes in full. Later in the week, Kurt starts looking into Frances' homework a bit more and sees that her science class has been discussing more about birds and how they lay eggs. Something about it interested him. He saw a weird parallel between birds laying eggs and the band itself. He feels like this new album is almost like a brand new egg to hatch. The old Nirvana is long gone, and this new Nirvana has an entirely different feel than the band had previously. It's raw, it's aggressive, it's straight to the point. Kurt feels like he has a lot to say this time around, and the best way to say it is to throw it directly in everybody's face. So far, the songs on the album are relentlessly heavy, with only a handful of softer sounding songs. That's what he wanted. He didn't want to explode into the mainstream again. Those days are over. Kurt is 37, and he knows he no longer looks cool to the younger generation. He's not the spokesman for the generation like he used to be. Now, he just wants to write music and release it. If people like it, that's great. If they don't, he doesn't seem to care much. The only opinion that matters now is his. During the recording sessions, Dave starts to suggest some more riffs and melodies that he had come up with himself. But at this point in the recording session, Kurt feels as if the album is done and they don't need any more content. So Dave moves on from the idea, and it's at this point in June of 2004 that Dave actively starts writing new music at home, sending demos to Taylor Hawkins. It seems that the Foo Fighters hiatus is almost ready to end. But it's clear Dave is still full force into Nirvana, with no signs of slowing down anytime soon. He merely sent the demos to Taylor just so Taylor had something to do and wasn't just sitting around doing nothing while he waits for Dave to finish up his quote-unquote vanity project. Later in the month, after the bulk of the recording is finished, Kurt goes into Frances' room to grab another book on birds, and the first thing he sees is PJ Harvey's face. Her latest album, Her, features Harvey's face front and center on the album cover. Frances must have picked up the album on her way home from school with her allowance money. Although Kurt doesn't confront her about it, he can tell that maybe his daughter misses PJ Harvey, but there's nothing he can do about that, and he tries to move on from thinking about her, because the more he thinks about her, he just puts himself in a bad place. He moves on and grabs another textbook from Frances's book pile and reads up on birds and smokes weed for the next few hours. It's at this point, on June 18th, 2004, Kurt comes up with the concept for the entire album. He wants it to feature birds and laying eggs, and the overall anatomy of those types of animals, as well as the process of laying eggs, and how the egg is formed inside of the body. He decides to call the new album Oviparous, which is the scientific term for an animal that lays eggs. When he first heard Frances say the word, it stuck with him. almost as if it was meant to be. He feels like the name gives off the proper vibes that he's looking to establish with this album. It's such a Nirvana name. It just worked out in his favor. On June 20th, Kurt starts sifting through old VHS tapes and clips of the band from the 90s to start cutting together a video for Rather Say. Later that night, Francis joins him and watches him edit the video. He uses his home PC but feeds the tapes through an old VCR to get that same tape quality effect digitally, as if the video itself was filmed on an old camcorder and distributed on VHS. He also decides he wants the entire video to be black and white, to differentiate itself from You Know You're Right video. He also feels like black and white will solidify the fact that this is old footage, and a send-off to the old Nirvana, basically telling the fans that this is the last thing from that old band, and to expect a new, different sound in the future. July 2004. Weeks into July, with the album more or less finished recording, Francis goes into Kurt's computer and sees that he hasn't even worked on the video. He only has about a minute edited into the 4-minute video after 2 weeks. She later asks him about it and why he hasn't finished the video, to which he responds with, "Oh, I haven't really thought about it." He then offers 12-year-old Francis to have a try at editing. At first, Francis is unsure what to think. She doesn't really edit videos, but then she decides maybe she will give it a try. Maybe it'll turn out just as good as it would have had Kurt continued. He makes sure Francis knows that all the material he's going to use is neatly placed in folders on his computer, and that all she has to do is essentially drag and drop the clips and piece them together. Francis spends the rest of the week editing the video. Kurt, on the other hand, is now starting to consider artwork and ideas for the album concept itself. Most of this album sort of just fell into place on its own without much effort, almost as if the stars aligned for Kurt and the band to produce this project. Kurt isn't quite sure what to do for artwork or anything of that sort as of this moment, but he also isn't overly worried about it. The artwork to him is the last piece of the puzzle. He has the songs and he has the name. Everything else just needs to fall into place like everything else did before it. During a chat with Chris Novoselic, Chris mentions that they should outsource for the artwork this time and have other people involved with the creative process of this album, making it bigger and better, almost like an ensemble cast in an independent movie, making it a bigger deal than it was originally set out to be. Chris suggests a new up-and-coming designer he discovered on the internet. Renowned graphic designer James Fischels from Cut Off Studios based in Iowa. He tells Kurt everything he's seen him create has been very much up Kurt's alley and that he thinks he will like his work, and that maybe the band should give him a call to see what he comes up with. Kurt has a look at some of his previous work and agrees to call him. On July 17th, Kurt receives a call from Paul. They talk about business pertaining to the band and the catalog, as well as the house in Scotland, to which Paul asks if the deal has been struck yet. Kurt responds by saying he more or less put it in the back of his mind and moved on from the idea, since he was feeling like the family attempted to rip him off, which completely bummed him out. Paul tells Kurt he should at least call them and give them an answer as to what he plans on doing, whether he buys the house or not. He should let them know. Kurt says he will and goes back to planning out the album concept. On July 18th, the following day, Francis completes the video for Rather Say. She shows Kurt the result and he is completely blown away by what she has created. It's just as good as he imagined it would be had he created it himself. He continuously watches it over and over again, looking for something that needs to be fixed, but he finds nothing of the sort. He's happy with the result now. He just has to find a way to release it. And with that comes Kurt's next issue. How to release any of this to the public. He's releasing an album on his own independent label with his own financial backing. And no manager. It's all up to him to make sure this album sees the light of day. Although he's no stranger to releasing his own music, he released Christotomy on his own label. But that album didn't do well. And that album also didn't have mainstream coverage. and that album didn't have the proper financial backing to go anywhere. Even if he released the album the way it was originally intended, without all the noise rock elements, it still wouldn't have done that well. So in this instance, he calls Dave, who has an experience with this sort of thing as well as the manpower to manage an entire album release at this caliber. Dave tells Kurt not to worry, and he says he will call Foo Fighters' production manager for advice on the release of Ovus. Another issue that comes about is the mixing of the album. Kurt says he will attempt to mix it himself, but he doesn't have the greatest track record at making things sound radio-friendly. Instead of outright mixing the album himself, Chris suggests Don Fleming, producer of Sonic Youth and Screaming Trees, and also Kurt's ex-wife's old band, Hole. Kurt says he's willing to give it to anyone at this point to take the pressure off of his back, but acknowledges that Don Fleming is actually a decent choice. By the end of July, Kurt knows it's important to get the Rather Say video into rotation, but notes that MTV has more or less demoralized itself into reality TV. So Dave suggested that they have their manager give Much Music a call and send the tape. The Canadian music industry, as well as the televised mainstream presence, is still very much alive and well at this point in 2004. Although the American mainstream has become a lot more of hip-hop and pop music, Much Music based in Canada still showcases a lot of hard rock and heavy metal on their mainstream rotation in 2004. Dave already knows this to be a huge benefit for the band, as it has helped his own band, Foo Fighters, in the past. The Canadian market is just as wide-ranged as the American mainstream, and to have any sort of credibility in this day and age in music, Nirvana needs to capitalize on their use of the Canadian listeners. On July 29th, the official music video for Rather Say is released on Much Music, with the station playing the video once every hour for the first 2 weeks of rotation. The song explodes onto the mainstream charts and elevated the band back up to the level they were around the release of Rohypnol, with a ton of speculation and Much Music reporting on the band every chance they get. By the end of July, Kurt is set to do a televised interview for the first time in years. He will sit down and talk about the new album at Much Music headquarters. Dave Grohl will be with him. The interview is scheduled for the first week of August. August 2004. The artwork for the album is completed, and upon first sight, Kurt loves it. It's exactly what he wanted based on the guidelines he gave the graphic artist. The album cover was initially an X-ray of a bird, edited to look like fossilized bird bones, with a slight green tint on the cover. This is an evolution. The back cover features a fresh baby bird hatchling, with the song titles pasted around the bird. It's exactly what Kurt asked for, or at least hoped for. The album itself is still being mixed at this time, but the band is in no rush and haven't even set an official release date as of this time. August 5th, 2004. Kurt and Dave do a sit-down interview with Much Music where they discuss the new album as well as other topics, such as the initial reuniting of the band in 2001 and the small string of local shows the band did in Los Angeles in 2002. They also speak on the return to Seattle just a couple months ago. This is the first televised public appearance of Kurt in quite some time. The last official live video recording of Kurt in the band was at the concert for New York in 2001. Nearly 3 full years since that moment. Speaking on that moment, Kurt would say, quote unquote, "Playing in front of a bunch of white men in suits was really off-putting for me, and I didn't want to do it initially. I was against even reforming this band in any capacity until my friend Paul convinced me to talk to Dave." He refers to Paul McCartney as my friend Paul, and not Paul McCartney. So anyone who doesn't know of their current relationship wouldn't have any idea who he's referring to. They talk about, quote unquote, not being friends for 6 years, and then getting back together like nothing happened. And how easy it was because they have known each other for such a long time. There's no hate involved. Everyone fell into the place they were meant to be in. Dave mentions he really started considering getting a hold of Kurt after hearing Christotomy. Dave was quoted as saying, "I think I heard Christotomy in the summer of 2000. It had been out for a few months and I didn't find out until someone showed me and they were like, 'Did you see Kurt Cobain's new album?' And I was like, 'Huh?' Come to find out, this guy had his own label and everything." He looks over at Kurt and says, quote unquote, "You gotta market your shit better, man." They both laugh before Dave continues, "It wasn't until Kurt called me like a year and some later that we actually talked. But yeah, I was considering it after hearing that album. I was like, fuck, I want to be a part of this. It was just so abrasive." And I think the new album is exactly that same atmosphere and feeling I had when hearing Christotomy for the first time. Kurt has long hair and a bit of a beard, much like we've seen him in the previous years. Dave looks like typical Dave in 2004. Kurt and Dave officially announced that they hope to have the album out to the world by September, merely a month away. Kurt promises that the album will be a throwback to 80s Nirvana and that he, quote unquote, hopes to stay away from that 90s grunge aesthetic that bogged us down back then. This is not grunge. This is hard rock music. Although, Dave says it's a far reach from what Foo Fighters have been doing recently with their contemporary, overly radio-friendly hit rock songs. Nirvana almost feels like a step back from that. A step back into what it actually feels like to be a raw, organic band. They chose Don Fleming because they knew he could produce the record, but also keep that level of raw aggression that was present in the immediate recordings. The band didn't want to lose the integrity it had by overproducing the record. They chose someone who knew how to get the levels just right. On August 6th, Green Day releases the single and music video for American Idiot. It peaks at number 61 on the Billboard Hot 100, which should give some focus on how the musical landscape has changed in the United States, with R&B and hip-hop leading the charts. Usher's "Yeah" is the top song in the country. The appearance of American Idiot on the U.S. singles charts occurred just prior to Billboard's inclusion of the internet download purchases into their Billboard Hot 100 chart data, which would have made a significant difference in the song's peak had it benefited from the new chart system. The song, however, debuted at number 1 in Canada, again shifting focus to how important the Canadian market for music is in the early 2000s, especially for rock music. The single for Rather Say, on the other hand, with its B-side being a cover of Fang's The Money Will Roll Right In, is peaked at number 15 in Canada, and hasn't been seen anywhere near the Billboard charts in America. This shows that the band has a lot of work to do if they want to maintain any type of mainstream appeal, if that's even what Kurt wants. Although, the video for Rather Say, cut together entirely by Francis Bean, based on Kurt's initial vision, has seen a heavy rotation on Much Music, even being voted for many times on Much On Demand. American Idiot coming out sort of took the wind out of the sails for Nirvana. The album hasn't even released yet. The band is still waiting on the final mix of the album. The video for American Idiot released and started a heavy flow of rotation wars, with viewers getting annoyed over how many times each video is played per day, to the point of overkill for each song. But each band's album is highly anticipated by its fans, with Green Day having more of a mainstream appeal due to them being an active band for the years prior. This doesn't take away from the power and importance of Nirvana's return. Oviparous is a big deal. Kurt has yet to realize the magnitude of this upcoming release. Kurt had set up a meeting with Charles Peterson to take some promotional photos of the band. But the day following his Much Music interview, Kurt watches the tape of the interview and just doesn't like his current look and the way he looks on television. He decides it's time for a change, and Kurt completely shaves his head, a look we haven't seen him with since 1997. The meeting with Charles changes due to this decision, and the photos that are taken will have a much different impact. Kurt will look completely different than most of the public has seen him previously. On August 10th, Charles arrives at a wildlife farm outside of the city to take photos of the band. Kurt had arranged some photos of the band to be taken with several different types of birds, as well as one particular photo of Kurt holding a baby bird, which will be featured on the inside of the album sleeve. The following day, the final mix of the album is completed, and Kurt receives a call to set up the final stages of the album release. On August 26th, Nirvana's Ovus is released to the public. It receives widespread praise from critics and goes on to sell 190,000 in its first week. Much to the band's surprise, they didn't expect this album to sell a portion of that, due to this being the band's first album in almost 10 years. But clearly the album has been highly anticipated, due to it being Nirvana's return. Old school fans of the band have been waiting for this album, and casual listeners are more or less curious as to what this album sounds like. And for fans of Foo Fighters who weren't around when Nirvana was big, there's also a major curiosity from that side of things. The official track listing of this album, comprised of all brand new songs we haven't heard in our real timeline, consists of these. Track 1, Collapse of Western Civilization, a 60-second noise intro. Initially, Kurt wanted this to be part of the first song, but after a disagreement with Chris, it was decided that this should be a skippable track, so fans don't have to sit through it to hear the first song. The first actual song on the album is track 2, All Wet Yet Nice. Track 3, Rather Say. Track 4, Real Eyes, a song which would later become another hit single from the band. Track 5, Living the Lie. Track 6, Friends of Mine, Eulogy Part 1, a song dedicated to Kristen Paff and friends of Kurt who have passed away. Track 7, My Summer. Track 8, Cheap Love Single. Track 9, Monologue, Eulogy 2, the second of the softer melodic songs featuring no drums. Track 10, Dope Sick, a song inspired by Kurt's breakup with PJ Harvey. Track 11, New Wave Suffer, a brand new version of Suffer from Christotomy, similar to New Wave Polly. Track 12, Timeline, Eulogy 3, the final eulogy song, a very short guitar-driven song featuring only guitar and Kurt singing. Track 13, So Unsightly. And the final track, Dweller, a song that was discarded from the Christotomy album. The album also features a hidden track that listeners can hear after sitting through 5 minutes of noise. The hidden track is titled Several Different Moods, All at Once. Although, in the UK, the song is featured on the album itself as the 15th track and is listed on the back of the album simply as Help. 3 days after the album releases, Kurt receives a call from Paul, congratulating him on the successful album release. He also asks if Kurt has been in contact with the Scottish family in regards to the property he wanted to purchase. Kurt informs Paul that he has spoken to the family, and that he has decided that the deal is off and he will not be buying the property. What Paul doesn't know is that Kurt never contacted them. He just decided on his own that it's not the right move to make, due to the high price of the property. He also knows Frances doesn't want to move to Scotland, and with having full custody of his daughter, he feels like he has to consider her wishes as well. It's just not worth it to him anymore. Now that the album has been officially released, Kurt would rather go on with business, and him and Paul begin discussing ideas for future releases to generate more revenue for Kurt and his family. Paul tells Kurt outright that in order to make any type of financial return from the album, he will have to play some shows with the band. The talks of a small U.S. tour are mentioned. At first, Kurt doesn't even want to hear the word tour. It wasn't until he spoke to Pat Smear about the idea that he started to be more opened up to the idea, knowing that merely just releasing an album with no shows lined up to promote the album will get him and the band nowhere, and they will find themselves in a hole financially due to no return on the revenue. Kurt will have to discuss the idea with the rest of the band, who have already toyed with the idea while recording the album, but nothing was set in stone at the time. September 2004. After the whole band agrees, American tour dates are scheduled for early October into early December. A soft schedule for the band who hasn't done any sort of touring together in 10 years. These 2 months of tour dates will get the band back into the swing of performing on the road, with only 2 to 3 shows scheduled per week over an 8-week period. To promote the upcoming tour, Kurt does a sit-down interview with Spin magazine. Candid shots of Kurt are shared within the article, showing him with his freshly shaved buzz-cut hairstyle. He talks about the creation of the album, as well as the concept, and hypes up the upcoming American dates. He also mentions the idea for a new music video for the band's upcoming single from the album, Real Eyes, which Kurt talks about as the best song on the album, and the one he's most proud of. And again gives nod to his friend Paul, who helped come up with the guitar part in the verse of the song. He still doesn't outright mention Paul McCartney by name. Around this same time, away from Nirvana, and taking time to himself before the tour begins, Dave Grohl starts jamming new material with Taylor Hawkins. Pat Smear is not involved with Foo Fighters at this moment, as he's preparing to embark on the U.S. tour with Nirvana, and Chris is more than excited to be actually going back on the road with the band. Dave is still very much focused on Nirvana, even enlisting Foo Fighters' road manager for the tour. The U.S. tour will really be the deciding factor on if this band can remain stable through the touring schedule. It's clear to us now that Nirvana's biggest fault in the 90s was not making it all the way through a tour. But now seemingly Kurt is in a better place. He's not on heroin, and he just wants to get his life back on track. The release of Ovus really helped his mindset, and he sees it as redeeming himself after the failure of Christotomy. Even Rohypnol. He claims Ovus is what Rohypnol should have been, but he's glad he was able to piece his life back together enough to see this album become a reality. On September 20th, about a week before the initial tour begins, Francis asks Kurt if this means they're not moving to Scotland, which Kurt responds with, "Yeah, we're not going." This makes Francis happy, and Kurt can tell. He just wants his daughter to be happy. Francis asks if he plans on bringing her along on the tour, and he responds with a simple, "Of course." Francis is excited. This is the first tour she will ever go on with her father. It'll be the first time she gets to see her father and his friends, who she now considers family, perform live on stage. She can't wait. October 2004. On October 9th, 2004, Nirvana plays their first show of the U.S. tour. The show takes place at a very familiar venue to the band, the Roseland Ballroom in New York. Although many of the shows take place around California and Seattle areas, there are a few stops around Iowa, New York, and Florida. They didn't go too crazy with the tour schedule, knowing the band's previous history with touring and the hardships the band has gone through over the years. At first, Kurt seemed in a great mood. The first few shows kicked off with a bang and were hugely successful, but 2 weeks into the 8-week schedule, Kurt becomes more distant from the other members, spending most of his time with his daughter, away from the band. He just wants to get it over with. 2 days are scheduled in between tour dates in October for a music video shoot for Real Eyes. Kurt didn't have much of an idea for the video. When asked what he wanted to do for the video, he said, "I don't know, something with birds and nature or something." Director Joseph Kahn was suggested by a friend of Kurt. Joseph is most recently known for directing the video for Purple Hills by D12. He had a very unique directing style and his use of bright colors and vibrant palettes. Kurt didn't bother to watch the D12 video, but chose to enlist Joseph anyway. He would later be quoted as saying, quote unquote, "Anybody can make this video. It almost didn't matter. Might let Francis edit this one too." Which turned out to not be the case. The entire video was filmed within 2 days and mainly features Kurt sitting on a wooden step and singing in nature. Realize will be Nirvana's first single of 2005, set to be released in January. The band continues lugging gear through the United States, with Dave taking time in between shows to write his own material. Some of which Kurt hears. On October 19th, 2004, after playing a grueling 2-hour set in Cincinnati, Ohio, the band gets a hotel room together for the first time since they started playing shows again. Usually all 4 members would get their own rooms and just do their own things, like any typical guy in his mid to late 30s. On this night, the band gets together with all 4 members in the same room. Everyone brought their guitars. Dave even brought his. Kurt and Pat go over some of the guitar parts on the album in preparation for the show in Cleveland tomorrow night. Dave starts plugging away at his guitar, kind of doing his own thing when Kurt stops and listens in, and begins humming a soft melody over Dave's guitar riff. And then Pat slowly starts adding his own little guitar part while Chris sits and watches the 3 create magic together. Dave looks at Kurt and says, "The melody I had in mind is actually very similar to yours," and he starts singing a soft melody of his own that was almost identical to the one Kurt had started humming when he first heard the riff. Kurt listens for a second and he begins humming along with Dave in harmony, as the 3 of them strung their guitars and basically come up with a brand new song right then and there. Kurt wishes he hadn't shrugged off Dave's songwriting when Dave had offered more insight on oviparous material. He wished they would have waited just a bit longer and worked together on a few more songs before settling on the album they had just released 2 months back. But after this night, Kurt knows there's more time. Why does it have to end here? This can surely continue the way it is and the band can release more material in the future. What Kurt doesn't know is that Dave has been jamming with Taylor Hawkins, and the 2 have been discussing a new Foo Fighters album. For anyone to think Dave would ever move on from Foo Fighters is simply foolish. That's his baby. He created that band and molded it into what it is. It is a huge part of his life. Nirvana is Kurt and Chris' band. Dave will always see it as Kurt's band, and Foo Fighters will always be his main focus. He just needed a break from being the face of the band. He needed a break from being a big rock star. He just wanted to sit in the back and play some drums like he used to and take the focus off of himself. But it's becoming evident that isn't possible. No matter what Dave does now, he will still somehow become the focus. He's the biggest star in Nirvana in 2004. We've talked before about how some fans of Foo Fighters grew up listening to them and not Nirvana. Fans like that see Nirvana as another side project for Grohl. But there's still a very large array of people who remember the Nirvana from their heyday, and those people are the ones keeping Oviparous afloat. By October of 2004, Oviparous is still selling very well, being released in late August and selling 190,000 in its first week. The sales were booming in that first week and then slowed down in the following weeks, but by no means have the sales stopped, with the album now having sold just under 300,000 copies within 2 months. On October 25th, John Peel, English radio host and journalist, passes away. As a tribute to John Peel, on October 31st, Nirvana's highly anticipated Halloween show in Seattle, Nirvana plays a cover of Teenage Kicks by the Undertones. John Peel repeatedly stated that this song was his favorite song of all time. Kurt, Chris, and Dave all knew that, and when they heard he passed away on the 25th, they immediately started practicing the song on their off days. They paid tribute to John and let the crowd know who he was and why he was important to the band. A picture of John is set up behind Dave as they play the song. The set list said they were set to play Smells Like Teen Spirit after the Teenage Kicks cover, but instead of playing Teen Spirit, they played Teenage Kicks again, twice in a row, before moving on to the rest of the set list. Nirvana skipped out on playing Smells Like Teen Spirit at Halloween 2004. The show would also go down in history for the band by having songs on the set list that were only ever played live once at this show. These songs include Teenage Kicks, the Undertones cover, Cheap Love Single. Kurt saw this as a throwaway song, and this is the only time the band ever played the song live. Lavender, a song from Christotomy. It was practiced twice beforehand, and Kurt decided to use it to fill up time. It's the only time the full song was performed with a full band. It was last played in Seattle in 1999, but Kurt cut the song short and started making weird animal noises into the microphone instead. A Napster version does exist, but in 2004 it is long lost on the internet since the album version was released in 2000. New Wave Suffer. Most of the recent Nirvana shows saw Kurt playing Suffer as it was heard on Christotomy, with just him and his guitar. On this Halloween show, however, they did the Oviparous version with the full band. And although they have played the song before, this will be the last time the band plays Podunk. The Halloween show is also known as a very energetic performance, and a DVD is later made of the performance in its entirety. November 2004. The final leg of the U.S. tour begins on November 8th. Kurt and the guys have been playing ruthlessly. The band is back in the saddle. Everything seems to be going fine. The album is doing well. It is still being sold. Another 50,000 copies sold the last couple weeks. The band is looking at the positive side of touring. The revenue gained from merchandise sales alone has fully paid off whatever it took to release the album on Kurt's label. Now his label is booming with sales and making a good portion of financial income. And this time around, all 4 members are getting an even 4-way split on the band's revenue. Everyone's happy. Why does it always feel like it's too good to be true? Kurt has also begun selling sellout merch, with t-shirts featuring the sellout logo being the top seller. On the night of a show in Tucson, Arizona, sound check is scheduled for 5 p.m. Kurt is not responsive in his hotel room. He's not answering the door, and he's not answering the phone. The band becomes concerned that they are going to find Kurt overdosed in his hotel room. It makes them upset to even think that could be the problem. Like, that's the first thing that they go to when they can't get a hold of Kurt. It must be drugs. It's sad for everyone involved. But that's not the case. Kurt is out cold with headphones on and forgot to set his alarm. He doesn't hear the knocking on the door. He doesn't hear the phone. He was up all night not able to sleep after the show that played the night before. He's not on drugs. In fact, he's been clean since that episode he had in Seattle when Dylan gave him those pills. He hasn't taken a single pill or any type of drug in months, and he's proud of himself. But it's not something he talks about. He keeps it to himself. Hotel staff finally gets the door open, and Chris immediately barges in and starts yelling at Kurt to wake up. Kurt wakes up and takes his headphones off and asks what's going on. Chris continues to tell Kurt that they missed sound check and that he's not happy with the fact that Kurt remains on drugs after all of these years, and that it disappoints him to see his friend in such a state. Kurt explains that he's just tired and forgot to set his alarm, and Chris doesn't believe him. He believes Kurt is lying, but chooses to not get into an argument and that they have to get to the venue. Pat and Dave are already there. Kurt wakes up and gathers his things, but he is visibly pissed off at Chris for accusing him of taking drugs and passing out. He chooses not to confront Chris, but it is clear that because of this occurrence, the entire mood of the next string of shows changes drastically, with Kurt seemingly not caring about being there and not putting on energetic shows. He more or less just stands there and plays, and leaves. It's sad to see. On November 20th, during a show in Los Angeles with 1 week left in the tour, Frances decides she doesn't want to be on the tour anymore and will instead spend the rest of the time that Kurt is gone with her mother, Courtney Love. After the show, Courtney Love is seen backstage. She's there to pick up her daughter. She even comes up and talks to the band, in which Kurt was civil with her and talked to her as if they were friends. He just wanted a nice atmosphere, and he was Frances' father. It was his goal to avoid any type of bullshit that might come along when Courtney arrives. Chris and Dave saw Courtney and were immediately reminded of the old days, and now with Chris thinking Kurt is on drugs, this is too familiar to those old days that everyone just wants to forget about. Chris makes a comment that Courtney should stay away because she's bad luck for the band, and Kurt gets angry and defends Courtney, and tells Chris to just go home. Kurt is tired of Chris' negativity and tired of having the fun sucked out of everything he does by other people constantly bogging him down. He reiterates that he's not on drugs, and he's tired of people getting involved with his personal life. Kurt tells everyone to go home and that he's canceling the final 5 shows of the tour for some much-needed sleep. Chris is visibly upset and immediately feels some guilt for lashing out at Kurt and blaming him for doing drugs without having any idea if he actually was. He feels like he just destroyed the band again. Chris had trouble adjusting back into a full-time band after being away from it for so long. Some people have an easier time transitioning back into that life, and others have a hard time. The pressures of being in a band like Nirvana is a feeling that none of us can truly comprehend because we've never felt that. Nirvana was in the midst of planning a European tour and a small leg of a Canadian tour in 2005. But now everyone is unsure of the state of the band again. Chris agrees to cancel the following tour dates and plans to give Kurt a call in a few days to apologize and hopefully work things out after everyone cools off. At the end of November, with Nirvana taking a small break, Dave gets together with members of Foo Fighters to record demos for a potential new album. December 2004. On December 2nd, Kurt receives a call from Chris, who is overly apologetic. He feels remorse for the last time the two spoke to each other. He feels guilty and that he's the reason Nirvana canceled the last few American tour dates. Kurt explains everything to Chris. He says he's not mad at him. But does remind Chris to stay out of his personal life and that they need to keep the band and their personal lives separated. He explains that the Realize video is still set to release in the next couple weeks, and that he still wants to embark on the European tour before the band inevitably crumbles into itself like it always has in the past. Kurt also tells Chris that it is important for the band to embark on a handful of Canadian shows, as the Canadian market has been more than beneficial for the band in the early 2000s. Kurt explains to Chris that he's off the hard drugs for good, and that's something only he can really be proud of because he knows what he's been through in the last decade. It feels like a weight has been lifted off his shoulders. He doesn't need to take drugs to enjoy things. He doesn't need to take drugs to feel better. It just happened one day. He thanks Dylan for giving him those pills when they played in Seattle. When he got sick from those pills, it changed his entire perception of drugs and what he should be doing with his life. He continues explaining that his daughter is the most important thing in his life, and he's merely doing this Nirvana stuff to secure a better future for her. Without Frances, Kurt knows he wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for her. He wouldn't have the drive he needs to go on tour with a band of this caliber without her. He says that Chris should be happy that Kurt had this epiphany, and that he felt disrespected when Kurt made a comment at Courtney Love, Frances' mother, while she was in the room. Kurt eventually accepts Chris' apology and assures him that the things they have planned for 2005 are still happening, as long as everyone else stays on board with the idea. Chris says he will call Dave and let him know that they worked out some of their differences. On December 15th, it is decided by Nirvana and their tour management group that the band will embark on a 2-month European tour, with 4 stops in Canada, one of which being a live performance on Much Music. The Canadian dates are set for the beginning of January 2005, with the European tour kicking off in mid-January, but before heading to Europe. In the 2-week break from touring, the band is set to make their first ever appearance on David Letterman on January 13th, 2005, to promote the newly released Realize video, which is scheduled to release to the public 1 day prior, on January 12th, 2005. All of these dates are planned in the same meeting on December 15th, 2004. Initially, Kurt is overwhelmed with all these dates and obligations, but owning his own label and the rights to his own music, he knows this means nothing but good things for him and Francis's future. And after the European dates, he can do whatever he wants. There's no obligations. He can retire if he wants to, or he can continue with the band and make more music. The cards are completely in his hand. With time off before embarking on a 2-month European tour, Dave Grohl sets more time aside to get together with Taylor Hawkins and Foo Fighters to work on more music and record more demos. Although Dave has previously stated that he is all in with Nirvana and doesn't mind doing both. Kurt doesn't know anything about Foo Fighters coming out of hiatus, so his thoughts on Dave working on new music outside of Nirvana is unknown. A week before Christmas, Nirvana releases a double single titled Christmas in Seattle. It is just 2 remastered tracks from Kurt's Christotomy record in 2000, Seattle Abridged and Vasectomy in 4 Countries. It is not re-recorded, but it is remixed by Don Fleming, the same producer who mixed and mastered Oviparous. It was initially conceived to boost more Nirvana sales and hopefully get more eyes on Oviparous for the holiday season. The songs are not Nirvana, but are labeled as such on this double single. The content on the double single has nothing to do with Christmas, and it was released with limited copies, and no further copies will be printed after they are sold. Years later, real issued copies will be highly sought after by fans due to their rarity. On Christmas 2004, Kurt takes Francis to Courtney's to spend the day at her mother's after initially opening all her gifts in the morning at Kurt's place. The two have some drinks together before Courtney asks Kurt if he'd rather stay the night at her place rather than driving all the way back home. Kurt decides against that and knows the two are drunk and that it's probably not a good idea to do that. He calls a cab and goes home. Frances will never admit it to her father, but she had wished Kurt would have stayed that night. By the end of the year, the band is getting ready to travel to Canada before embarking on a 2-month European tour. Dave Grohl spends more time writing new music at home before setting out to play drums and market Oviparous into 2005. Rolling Stone releases the 100 Best Albums of 2004 on New Year's Eve. Nirvana's Oviparous lands a surprising number 47 due to the powerful impact of the band's return in the past few years. The sales have plateaued on the album by the end of 2004, but it is still selling. A small boost in sales came from Christmas in Seattle. Some American fans didn't even know Oviparous was out, due to poor marketing from Sellout Records. Discovering Christmas in Seattle helped them discover Oviparous, and those fans bought both albums. So the marketing strategy of that holiday release seemingly worked. The European tour in 2005 will surely boost the sales even more once the band starts promoting themselves in the UK. Things are looking up for Kurt in the band, but we will have to wait to find out if the band can maintain themselves through the next year, or if it will all come crumbling down again as it has many times in the past. Before midnight on New Year's Eve, Kurt receives a phone call. It's Courtney Love. They talk right through the New Year celebration. This will conclude If Kurt Cobain Lived, 2004. I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this series. And please stay tuned for If Kurt Cobain Lived, 2005. Also, please stay tuned for Nirvana's Oviparous from 2004. Thank you for watching.